مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ابتدأ الرئيس جو بايدن عام 2023 بمزاج إيجابي. في انتخابات نوفمبر بقي الديمقراطيون مسيطرين على مجلس الشيوخ، وخسروا مجلس النواب بهامش بسيط فقط. ومنذ ذلك الحين انخفضت نسبة التضخم وكذلك سعر البنزين. كما أن زيارة الرئيس الأوكراني المفاجئة إلى واشنطن أدت إلى بروز دور بايدن في المعركة العالمية لأجل الديمقراطية. إلى أن الأخبار السارة لا تدوم طويلا في واشنطن، وبدأت الحكاية السياسية بالتغيير، وذلك بعد اكتشاف وثائق السرية من إدارة أوباما داخل المنزل الذي يقضي فيه بايدن إجازاته في ولاية دلوير. وفجأة أصبح هناك محقق خاص يحقق مع بايدن، كما أن هناك محقق آخر يحقق مع الخصم السابق ومستقبلي دونالد ترامب. كيف ستؤثر أزمة الوثائق السرية على إدارة بايدن؟ وما هو تأثيرها على الأكثرية الجمهورية الجديدة في الكونغرس؟ هل ستتوقف الانتقادات الموجهة إلى دونالد ترامب؟ لمناقشة تبعات فضيحة الوثائق السرية يسرني أن أستضيف لجنة من الخبراء السياسيين نيومي ليم، سارة فارس, وديفيد هوكينغز. Welcome back to Dakhil Washington. A docudrama is a fictionalized version of a true story, a documentary that's also dramatic cinema. But the term has taken on new meaning with the discovery of secret documents in President Biden's vacation home in Delaware. Coming just days after the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, this was like throwing red meat into a dog kennel, especially given the Mar-a-Lago scandal of secret documents kept at President Trump's home in Florida. What is this all about? What are the documents? When and how were they found? And what does it all mean? I'm delighted to have Sarah Ferris, David Hawkins, and Naomi Lim to help explain all this docudrama for our viewers throughout the Middle East. All right, Sarah, what is this all about?
So basically, we learned about all of this in early January, and essentially that there were about 24 documents that were discovered, first discovered in November. We didn't learn about this until, as I said, mid-January, and these were marked classified. This is the biggest the biggest kind of security breach that can happen to a public official. This is exactly what you do not want to happen. And so, of course, this quickly took over everything that was happening in Washington, despite a protracted speaker battle and all kinds of, really interesting political stories as the Republicans were taking over. This is what happened. And so these were discovered as lawyers were in Biden's think tank. There's a couple of different parts, but I think one of the more interesting ones, and the first one was when they discovered the documents locked away in a cabinet and brought the lawyers in, contacted the National Archives, and I'm sure we can talk about some of the other details, but that's essentially the gist. And everyone saw the news.
These documents were just sitting next to the dog food and the bicycles in the garage of Joe Biden's vacation home. David?
Well, so as Sarah just said, some documents have been found in two different places. And just to emphasize, these are documents that were given to Joe Biden when he was the vice president, which of course ended in 2016. So they have been sitting around for the subsequent 6 years. Two places. One was an office that he maintained in Washington, where he was a professor. He had an academic appointment that didn't amount to too much teaching. And the other one, yes, was apparently, then they were in boxes, in some sort of files, not on open display. And the other documents were in the garage of his personal residence in Wilmington, Delaware. Yes, in crates, apparently right next to his favorite car, which is a Corvette.
And Naomi, when this emerged, we were already in the middle of a docudrama with Donald Trump. How is this different or similar to that episode?
You're exactly right. I think this country finds itself in this really unusual predicament where one former president and one sitting president have a special counsel appointed to see whether they mishandle classified, documents. There are some similarities between the Trump case and the Biden case. One of them is that both the highest level of classified information was found on both of their private properties. But what Democrats are really trying to stress is that there are lots of differences as well. And the key one of them is how sort of the Trump legal team versus the Biden personal team, as well as the White House counsel, have reacted or responded to just being upfront with their existence. So, for example, as Sarah said, as soon as the personal attorneys found these Biden documents at the think tank, they let the National Archives know. Then the National Archives sort of discloses information to the Justice Department, and what we've seen is this slow drip of information, not always to the public straight away, but definitely to the federal authorities, and that's sort of different. One other big difference is just like the sheer volume that were uncovered at Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. I mean, there were sort of thousands of documents, a lot of there were cases where a folder with the classified markings were found, but it was empty. So there's sort of a lot of questions about whether those documents still sort of exist. So, there are some similarities, but I think, there is credence to the Democrats and the White House argument that there are also fundamental differences.
And Sarah, tell me a bit about Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, and the awkward situation in which he finds himself.
Right. This is, of course, a Democratic administration. So Merrick Garland is appointed by Joe Biden, and the Justice Department, we know now, I think the Wall Street Journal reported that the Justice Department did consider whether the FBI should be involved here, whether they should, as they did in the Trump case that Naomi just outlined, whether the FBI should be part of the team that's searching and looking for why did this happen? What exactly happened? Are there more documents? All of that. And as we know, what happened was that they appointed a special counsel, which is completely separate. This was so that the Biden administration could say, look, we are going to have someone who has no connection to my administration look into this. And that's clearly Merrick Garland and his team knowing that things could look optically very bad if anything went astray here. If they didn't properly look into this, it would draw a lot of criticism for being political and being partisan. So there's Democrats on Capitol Hill that say we're happy that a special counsel was appointed. We can have this looked into. It's a serious matter, and hopefully we'll get the answers. But it's clear that Merrick Garland did not want to be the one doing this himself.
All right, so David, help us understand what all this toing and froing means. Does it handicap the Biden administration in some way? Does it put a cloud over their ability to do certain things, or is this just a technical matter that will fly under the political radar over the next period of time? Well,
that's the great question. It will depend on how quickly this special counsel, who has been appointed to look into the Biden matter, how quickly, and he, by the way, underscoring Sarah's point, Garland appointed a prosecutor who'd worked for the Trump administration to do this job. So to try and further distance it from politics, it depends how quickly this will happen, how quickly this happens, and whether there are more revelations. As we talk now, it seems relatively, the story hasn't changed in a few days. It changed pretty quickly for a few days. Now it's stopped changing. A limited number of documents found in two places, immediate cooperation from the Biden people, willingness to turn it all over, no evidence that Biden himself hid these documents. Of course, he was the vice president. At the end of his vice presidency, there were tons of aides packing up boxes and trying to move them out. It is possible that he had know that his fingerprints, literally and figuratively, were never on these documents, and they were packed up and secreted in boxes that nobody ever thought about for 6 years, in sharp contrast to Donald Trump, who says, these are my documents. Of course I took them. They belong to me, in contrast to federal law, which is they don't belong to him. So it's a big distraction as the year begins. Does it neutralize Merrick Garland's ability to prosecute Donald Trump for something that at this point seems much more egregious in terms of obstruction? Potentially so. Would it handicap Joe Biden's ability to run for re-election? I think potentially so, but it'll depend on how quickly it's cleaned up.
Naomi, do you want to add on how this might be affecting the political environment here in Washington?
Yeah, I think just to underscore David's point, I think when you look at this, there are two prisms. One is the legal and one is the political. The legal exposure that Biden has, sort of talking to my sources, is a little bit slighter than the one that's sort of been put upon Trump. One, because he's a sitting president, and sitting presidents, we now know, can't be sort of prosecuted while they're in office. So that buys Biden some time in terms of how the legal processes play out. Also, the different the different provisions under what the Justice Department is investigating are slightly different. Biden's is sort of just whether he, mishandled the documents. Trump's involves obstruction of justice, as well as whether he showed people the documents. Politically, it's a little bit more murkier. Excuse me. The White House is sort of biding its time in terms of it thinks that this will roll over. It thinks that it has handled this well. It's been upfront about it to a degree. And we're sort of seeing already where the debt ceiling fight is going to maybe overshadow what is happening in the background here, as David said, until we know the results of Robert Hur's special counsel advice. Also, in terms of the political things, political aspect, we sort of have to ask whether it brings up this idea of competence and experience, something that Biden ran on as a candidate and sort of had it chipped away with his withdrawal from the Afghanistan war. Potentially some critics say how he handled the pandemic. So it sort of brings up those questions again, as this person who sort of touted and promoted their government experience, how could they be so sloppy with classified information that my sources tell me is very easily identifiable?
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to connect all this to the issues that Naomi began to raise about the debt ceiling and all the other political fights that are brewing here in Washington. We'll do this just after the break. Joining us again today is Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers Congress for Politico, a multimedia platform that is all politics all the time. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she has also reported for The Hill and The Washington Post. Also with us is Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at The Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. And with us again today is David Hawkins. David is senior editor of The American Leader, a nonprofit taking on America's biggest systemic problems. He was also founding editor of thefulcrum.com and spent 2 decades as senior editor at CQ and Roll Call, 2 must-read news sites covering Capitol Hill. All right, David, when this docudrama emerged, details also came out about how Republicans are planning to deal with the vital but obscure issue of the debt ceiling. What is this all about? And why are Republican plans to raise it in an odd way? And why are Republican plans raising eyebrows to how to address the debt ceiling issue?
These are great questions. So the first thing is the debt ceiling is obscure, especially to our audience today, because this challenge that faces Congress faces only one other country in the world, which is Denmark. Denmark and the United States are the only 2 countries in the world where the political branch of government has to take a vote to borrow money, the money necessary to pay the government's bills. In every other country, if such debt is allowed, it's automatic. When it's time to borrow more money, they borrow more money. Why is this? Because paying the bills is an obligation. If a government doesn't pay its bills, its economy goes in the tank. These are bills. So the fight now is whether the government should pay bills for policies that have been agreed to by presidents of both parties, by Congresses of both parties. These are bills in the past. Raising the debt ceiling is not about making decisions to spend new money, to spend more money. This is about, again, reiterating, about paying for things that have already been decided. That does not stop the Republicans from wanting to essentially hold this decision hostage to getting concessions on their fiscal policies, which are to dramatically reduce spending and maybe even to cut taxes. So this has been a Republican strategy now for more than a decade. It pushed the United States, very close to a default about a decade ago. These Republicans seem even more intent on getting their way than the quite combative Republicans of a decade ago. I think it's a dangerous time for the American economy.
And so what sort of ideas have been floated by certain Republicans, Sarah, to address the thorny issues of what America does spend and doesn't spend on in the event that there is no raised debt ceiling?
So conservative Republicans have been most vocal about generally cutting spending. And as David said, this is the same fight that we saw about a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, when we saw the so-called Tea Party Republicans coming in 2010, 2011, really gung-ho about just slashing spending across the board, this idea of balancing the nation's credit card, the idea of kind of going back to a time where we could reach balanced budgets. And it was this very lofty conversation then. What the difference now is the Tea Party Republicans back then, that was really the goal, was to get to this era of balanced budgets. And they thought it could happen. And they just wanted to cut spending as much as possible on both the discretionary side that Congress controls, as well as the mandatory side, which is Social Security, Medicare, the huge, huge programs that are sort of on autopilot now. But the Republican Party of now is far less ideological about spending in that way. A lot of these folks came in under the influence of Donald Trump. It was much less about this doctrine of cutting spending and much more about what is the Trump party today? What kind of leverage can we use here? And so the Republicans I'm watching now, having covered a little bit of that fight back then, the difference now is I think Republicans are just trying to use this as a tactic, trying to see what they can extract from Biden, what they can extract from Democrats, and less about just getting the spending down, just controlling the federal debt. I'm hearing a lot more about what can we get and less of this is the only way to control spending. And that can still change. We still have a couple weeks, maybe even months before this really comes to a head. But I think it's not as clear cut as it was 10 years ago when the goal was just we are spending too much as a country. We need to rein it in. And that's to say nothing of a potential recession, which we can get into. I think that could certainly have an impact as well.
So I'm reading between the lines. It sounds like you think as though there might be a solution out there. That doesn't lead to national bankruptcy along the way. Naomi, do you agree?
Well, I think what's really interesting is the White House's opening bargaining negotiating position, which is sort of echoed by Democrats on the Hill, which is, we want the debt ceiling raised without conditions. It's a phrase that they've repeated plenty of times, not only from Biden himself, but also from the press briefing room. And I think that they sort of argue that, that it's been raised sort of countless times in the past on a bipartisan approach. And so why can't they continue doing that? But as Sarah said, we've now seen this sort of, especially after the speakership fight, how sort of strident that these more conservative Republicans can be when they choose a fight that they are willing to sort of get into the trenches under.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Fascinating discussion connecting the legal troubles with the political realities and where they're going in American politics in the months ahead. Thank you, Sarah, Naomi, and David for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. Something unusual happened in American football just after New Year's Day. But if you blinked, you may have missed it. On January 2nd, The Buffalo Bills were playing the Cincinnati Bengals in a Monday night football game. During an otherwise nondescript play, a Buffalo defensive player named Damar Hamlin tackled a Bengals wide receiver named T. Higgins, the sort of play that happens dozens of times a game every week. But this time was different. Hamlin got up after the tackle, took a step, and then collapsed. In front of millions of viewers, he had cardiac arrest, though no one knew it at the time. Athletic trainers rushed to the field to tend to the player, now slumped on the ground, immobile. Within minutes, an ambulance was on the field with paramedics performing CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. More than 60,000 fans were silent. Players and coaches fell to a knee, praying for the fallen player. Television sports announcers said they had never before seen this in a game. After a few minutes, the ambulance sped off to the local hospital. With Hamlin in the care of professionals, what should happen back at the stadium? Should the game continue? After a few minutes, wise heads prevailed. The game was suspended. Later, it was formally canceled. For the first time in memory, a professional sporting event would never be completed because one of its players was injured. For an hour, or maybe a day, there was shock and horror, both within the sport and among the nation at large. Coaches, commentators, sports writers all intoned the essential truth. The game is meaningless compared to the health and well-being of this fine young man. They said this with fervor, intensity, and sincerity. Hamlin had launched a fund to raise money to purchase toys for disadvantaged children, with a goal of raising just $2,500. Within 10 days, the fund had attracted more than $8.6 million. For a brief moment, maybe, just maybe, the horror at what happened to Damar Hamlin seemed to shock America into a fundamental reappraisal of the purposeful violence that makes football, football. For a brief moment, after 23 million people watched him collapse and nearly die on live television, people began to ask, is football really worth this? And then, just as quickly as it arrived, the moment passed. With excellent medical care, Hamlin survived, and he has since been released from hospital. They never finished the Bills-Bengals game, but both teams went on to the postseason playoffs, which have already begun. I watched a bunch of those games this past weekend, and Hamlin's scare was barely, if ever, mentioned. The gladiators were put back to work. The days of bread and circus returned. Now, there's potential for injury, even terrible injury, in just about every sport. As a child, for example, I remember an all-star career for a Boston Red Sox player, Tony Conigliaro, cut short by a near 100-mile fastball he took to the head. But football is different. The game is all about violence, controlled and channeled to be sure, but violence nonetheless. And even the close call of a near death on live television could not really dent its appeal. Does this say something about America? I don't want to read too much into this, but I think the answer is yes. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن فضيحة الوثائق السرية، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو راسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك حين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.